next speaker is Ross Tereski. He has deep experience working in a variety of industries, including IT, education, management consulting, and banking and finance, as well as the public sector. Ross has studied both here and abroad, and has also been a guest lecturer at Monash University. If you would please now just join me in welcoming Ross as he explores the 7 mistakes that companies make when applying for government grants and how best to avoid those.
Just before I begin, I'm really excited to give you this presentation because we deal with this on a day-to-day basis. We sometimes take it for granted, but for people who aren't familiar with these mistakes, it can actually make a very significant difference to your business. So how many of you are excited about how to avoid the common grant mistakes? That's a lot of people. All right. So that's what we'll be talking to you about, the 7 common grant mistakes, and more specifically, how to avoid them. And let me start with an analogy. Imagine a desert. It's all dry, and you're in need of water. And somewhere far away, you actually see an oasis. The luscious greens, the water that you need. And so you spend your energy moving towards that oasis. But the closer you go, the farther it moves away from you. And sometimes it becomes a mirage. Sometimes when you actually get there, you find that it's only quicksand that drains your energy. And for some of the companies that we've dealt with, that's what the grant application process is. But it doesn't have to be this way. So typically, this is what happens. It sounds simple. You complete an application form, you wait a couple of months, and then you sign an agreement and you start spending the money. But, is it really that easy? Well, there's a lot of people actually laughing right now to realize that that's not the case most of the time. In fact, a lot of the businesses, they have to read hundreds of pages of guidelines. They have, oftentimes they're given the runaround, and they spend a lot of time filling out complex forms. And the result? They get a thanks but no thanks rejection letter. So now that I've actually scared you all into listening, this is what we'll be talking about. I'll be talking about a very brief overview of grants, and then the meat of a presentation, which is the 7 common grant mistakes, and obviously how to avoid them. A couple of free resources, and also a number of current grants and the entitlements that you can apply for. So let's begin. Now grants, how many of you pay taxes? Every hand should be up. How many of you actually get grants? There's a couple of companies. Well, essentially it's a process. A portion of your taxes actually gets paid out as grants. So there is a cycle. But the question is, are you getting those grants? And for many companies, the answer is no. Now this is the funding pyramid. Because there's a limited number of grants, and there's a lot of companies that want to apply for them, it's actually a very competitive process. So a lot of people apply, but not a lot of people get them. So we've developed the funding pyramid as a way to visually communicate how many people generally are successful in getting grants. So at the very bottom of the pyramid are the people who don't read the guidelines, they just put something in and automatically they're deemed as unsuccessful because they haven't followed the guidelines. That's 15%. It's not a lot of people. It's not a lot of companies. A little bit higher up, you have the companies that did spend a bit of time, they've read the guidelines, they put in a bit of work, but because they underestimated the amount of time it takes and they didn't have maybe all the resources that they needed, they actually put in a low quality submission. So the result is the same. These people, they still get an unsuccessful letter. Now the 25%, these are the people who actually did a little bit more work, they read all the guidelines, they talked about the national benefits, they communicated some value to the application, and depending on how much funding is available, they may get government grants or they may not. At the moment, because there is less money around, these candidates are likely to be unsuccessful as well. Until you get to the 20%. Now these are the absolute best projects. So for example, if you have 100 applicants, 20 of them would score high in every single criteria. They'll communicate the national benefits, they'll have low levels of risk, and they'll provide a significant benefit to the government. So these projects usually get funded in any economy. Now because it actually says 20%, but because the economy is a little bit tight at the moment, there's less money available. So what we found in our experience, it's about 10%. So what that means for your company is you really have to be in the top 10% in order to be successful. And what prevents you being in the top 10%? Well, these are the 7 common grant mistakes. So these are the first 3. And these are the following 4. Now, if you look at them, they're not really unheard of. They're quite common, but you'll be surprised as to how many businesses actually make them. In fact, can I just get a raise of hands if anyone has made one of these mistakes? Yeah, they're very common. Now, that's how companies actually feel when they realize that they've made these mistakes. That's how they feel. So, and if you're wondering if there's any preference, if there's any specific order, there's no order, they're all important. The reason I've put them this way is to put the picture of Homer Simpson in. So they're all important, they're all 7. All right, so let's begin. Let's delve into the mistakes. The first one is actually not assessing eligibility before applying. Now, the idea of getting government grants is very exciting to people. It's free money from the government, you don't have to pay it back. And because of that, a lot of people, they get really, really excited. They think they have nothing to lose except for time, frustration, management limitation, and ultimately, if you aren't successful, just being really upset and potentially not applying in the future. So there's actually a lot to lose. That's why you have to ensure that you're eligible. Now that's not as easy as it sounds, because even though your industry itself might be eligible, your business might be eligible, you really need to look at the project and to see whether or not it's going to get funded. Because it all depends on the expenditure and whether or not you have eligible expenditure. So you really have to ensure that your project is eligible. It doesn't matter how good it is. If it's not eligible, it's going to go in the, it's not going to go in the bin, it's probably going to go into the recycling basket, which is not what you want. Okay, leaving you up to the techies. Now, how many of you are technical people? Hopefuls. 35, thank you. Now, with the techies, they're great, and they're really good at doing analysis. But the problem is that they have a very focused point of view, and they tend to be really into detail, and sometimes they miss out on the bigger picture. Whereas in reality, what the government is trying to achieve by offering grants is to achieve large business outcomes. So there is a disconnect between the technical aspect, which is low level, and the business objectives, which is high level, and that causes problems. For example, in our company, I once requested a one-page summary, and instead I got a 25-page report from a technical person, which was really complex. Not only that, but it actually breached the page limit. Quite often grants, they have only a certain number of pages you can attach. So it's very important that the technical people, they look at the information, but ultimately you try to address the business objectives, the business outcomes. Asking for too much money. Everyone's guilty of this, and every single time we deal with a client, the question is, what is the maximum? As soon as we tell them what the maximum is, they tell us, let's just go for that. If it's $500,000, they say, let's go for $500,000. If it's $300,000, they say, let's go for $300,000. And look, you can understand where they're coming from, because if they're going for a little bit less, then actually shortchanging themselves. And that's a pretty narrow view, because you have to look at the bigger picture. There are other companies, in fact, there are often hundreds of other companies applying for funding. And if you are asking for the maximum amount, you're potentially being seen as greedy. And you also have to look at the value for money from the government's point of view. And your project looks different from a value for money perspective if you're asking for $100,000 than if you're asking for $500,000. So it's always better to ask a little bit under the maximum. But the real key is to have a balance. You need to balance how much money you're asking for versus the strength of the application. If you have a highly targeted project, if you have a lot of national benefits, and if it's really hot on the government's agenda, then you can probably ask for more. Otherwise, it's probably better to ask for less. But it's a scale, that's what it is. But the main thing that you always need to be aware of is you have to co-contribute. You have to have some skin in the game. Because if you're not willing to put some of your money in, why should the Australian taxpayer put their money in as well? So it's very important that you provide a contribution towards the project, a cash contribution. We recommend at least 20%. And that way, this is also important because quite often you provide quotes, and there's a suspicion that perhaps your quote's a little bit overinflated, so you can get more of a grant. But if you can actually co-contribute, then it minimizes the risk for the government. And the safer is your project, the easier it is for them to say yes.